Okay, why don't we get started? As I said, I'm Steph Haggard. This is the KPP webinar series, which has gotten very generous support from the Korea Foundation. We're always happy to acknowledge that support. They've really, they allowed us to do this thing, which we very much needed to do given the inability to convene in person. Let me just tell you what's coming up in the series, and then I'll introduce our speaker today. So the next three topics range pretty widely. We're going to have a session next week from Jung-Sung Yoo, who's the director of the Korea Inequality Research Lab at Gachon University, on inequality in South Korea. On November 9th, we're going to have a panel on the North Korean economy that Moon-Sub is actually going to chair, and we'll hear from Byung-Young Kim, who's a professor at SNU. Probably has one of the best books on the North Korean economy, if not the best book on the North Korean economy. Bill Brown, who spent a long time in government, in the intelligence community looking at North Korea. And then I'll report on some work I've done recently with a former GPS student on indicators and quantitative data on North Korean trade. And then November 16th, a panel I'm particularly looking forward to on purges in communist systems. Drawing on some of our people here, Zui Trin, Edward Goldring from USC, and Victor Xu. And we'll be talking about how purges work in communist systems, including North Korea. I'm particularly pleased to introduce our speaker today, Aram. I met Aram when she was a graduate student at Princeton, and she had written this wonderful piece involving North Korean refugees and how they were integrated into the South. And she's subsequently gone on to publish in the British Journal of Political Science and in Comparative Politics. And she has a book manuscript in the works called Narratives of Duty, How National Stories Shape Civic Duty in Asia, which is a really interesting take on this question of civic culture in Asia and how it relates to democratization. Today, she's going to be reporting on some research with the title National Belonging and Civic Integration, Evidence from North Korean Refugees. And of course, this touches on the very important question of how North Korean refugees are being integrated now. And given their small number, what would happen were a catastrophic event to happen that would create even more refugees that would have to be integrated in the South, and the possible effects that might have on South Korean democracy. So Aram, thanks very much for joining us. We're really happy you could do this.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me pull up my screen here. Okay.
Great, that looks good.
Right, so today I'm talking about national belonging and really sort of this limits of civic integration. And this work grows out of kind of a response to the recent civic turn. So as global migration has really peaked and continues to accelerate, a lot of Western host democracies have adopted sort of exclusively civic integration policies. So these are policies that require linguistic, civic, or even political skills requirements for entry and then also long-term membership. And because the focus is more on sort of what newcomers can do and contribute to the host society rather than sort of who they are, it's often seen as sort of a more inclusive way of integration as far as integration policies go. But the debate over sort of the merits of civic integration suffers from two, I would say, shortcomings. The first is that much of that debate has focused on perspectives of the host state. So what are the benefits from the host state's perspective? What are sort of policy design and timing effects that the host state can control? Or from the perspective of normative theory, so trade-offs between multiculturalism and assimilation. The other shortcoming is really more empirical and what I would describe as a kind of regional selection bias problem. So most of the studies on global migration come from a handful of Western host contexts. Meanwhile, the bulk of global migration actually happens outside of those cases, where a lot of the migration is intra-regional and between co-ethnic populations. So what we're seeing here, as Sarah Wallace Goodman says, is there are not as of yet that many testable hypotheses for predicting effects of immigrant-related policy. So there's kind of a dearth of theoretical framework or development here of exactly why some integration policies might be more effective than others and for whom. So the big puzzle that the research speaks to is, what explains the effectiveness of civic integration in some places, but not others. And I approach this question in a way that addresses those two shortcomings that I just talked about. So the first is to really shift the viewpoint of this question to the people that are most proximate to the integration policies, which are the newcomers themselves. I focus on refugees as a particular group of newcomers, and the focus here is really on refugees' own beliefs about successful belonging and how that matters to their integration experience. The other point here is to really expand our comparative coverage of this question, looking at sort of a most different context from the typical Western migration context. So I look at North Korean refugees in South Korea, which presents not only a co-ethnic, but as I'll talk in a little bit more, a co-national migration context. And to preview the answer here a little bit, essentially, I treat integration policies not just as sort of a top-down kind of thing, but really as an interactive site where meanings of belonging are contested, where the state is seen as a real sort of personal actor in the integration process. And what I find is that the effectiveness of civic integration is largely conditional on the degree of fit between the newcomer versus the host's endorsed belonging ideal. Now, you might say that that seems obvious in hindsight, but it certainly has not been the guiding principle behind the designing of integration policies. So,
Aram, can I just interrupt you for one moment? I promise not to do it again, but I wanted to ask one clarifying question and then also just remind our audience, if you do have questions and you put them in the Q&A, I can pass them on to Aram, and if they seem appropriate to interrupt her flow, I will, and if not, we'll let her finish. But can you just say one more word about the concept of civic integration, or are you going to address that?
sure.
Like what that means, what it
Yeah.
means.
Practically speaking, civic integration essentially is sort of a response to what used to be very heavily national assimilationist policies, where the expectation was sort of cultural assimilation into the host society. And the civic integration, sort of in contrast to that, focuses much more on, as I said, sort of what newcomers can do and what they can contribute to the host society. So a lot more emphasis on, do you have the requisite language skills? Do you have the requisite knowledge of sort of the civic history and civic rules in this host society? So it's very much more sort of a practice-based approach to integration than it is sort of an identity assimilation approach.
Okay, that's useful. Thanks.
So I've said a lot about civic integration, but in practice, actually isolating the effectiveness of civic integration policies is quite messy and hard, because civic integration policies, when we say, the effectiveness of that, we're talking really about sort of civic content of integration policies. But even in purportedly civic integration regimes, civic integration requirements are paired with other kinds of national gatekeeping requirements, different laws around which groups are even sort of eligible to be to gain entry into the country. And so isolating the civic effect is actually really hard in practice. And the case of South Korea's integration of North Korean refugees in this regard provides a lot of comparative but also inferential advantages. So, as probably everybody in this audience knows, despite radically different governments, both Koreas, at least in principle, have mutually upheld this one nation idea. Now, part of this has long historical reasons due to sort of the way that Korean national identity was racialized as kind of a survival response to Japanese colonialism, but it also has much more contemporary political reasons. The co-national principle has been very useful for both Koreas separately in terms of sort of gaining autonomy from foreign powers for electoral advantage, for defense purposes. And so there's real political reasons why this principle has been upheld. What this means for the integration of North Koreans is two things. So all North Korean refugees are eligible for South Korean citizenship upon entry and upon security clearance. Right. So here, exposure to civic content of the integration policies is not predicated on some kind of national exclusionary boundary. So it's separated from the national gatekeeping function. And the second is that upholding this principle really constrains South Korea's integration policy toward North Koreans specifically to be explicitly and exclusively civic. Now, I should note that South Korea does not uphold these types of policies for other kinds of co-ethnic return migrants like Joseonjo. This is something that's sort of exclusively reserved for North Korean refugees. What does all of this mean? Well, if you look at sort of the curriculum of Hanawan, which is the hallmark integration policy, it's the government resettlement center that all North Korean refugees are required to spend 3 months in after entry and before they can enter South Korean society. If you look at the curriculum, I mean, this curriculum is often described by different scholars as sort of a workfare approach. The majority of course hours at Hanawan are devoted to things like job training, civic and social education, initial settlement education. And when you look at the actual textbooks and the course content, these are really practical life skills of how to get a job, how to go vote, how to open a bank account, very much in the civic flavor of sort of, do you have the skills and resources to contribute to the host society proactively? And so South Korea provides a case where the host state has a very clear and coherent civic integration policy. And that sort of clarity makes it a pretty rare and also ideal setting in order to look at how integration policies actually work. So in the project, I take an iterative within case approach. So there's a heavy emphasis here on sort of strengthening the internal validity of the theoretical approach. So it's a two-step process. So I start by looking at refugees' personal narratives of their integration experience. And here the point is to really inductively identify from these narratives the role that a refugee's belonging ideal plays in his or her integration experience. This is really sort of the theory building step of the project. And then, building on what I learned from those narratives, I derive a set of hypotheses and then test that hypothesis on survey data on individualized integration outcomes for that same North Korean refugee population to see if that hypothesis actually holds in sort of an, quote unquote, out of sample test outside the narrative sample in the broader refugee population. So I want to start with the findings from the narrative analysis. And here I'm really looking at the refugees' personal narrative from starting with sort of their life in North Korea pre-defection, what happened after crossing the border, where they were, how long they were in that third country before entry, and then basically what their life has been since entry into South Korea. And I'm basically process tracing what happened in each of those critical life windows to see, what is really shaping their integration experience. The biggest sort of surprise, at least for me, that came out of this analysis is that North Korean refugees approach the concept of successful belonging or ideal membership in this sort of ordered hierarchical manner. So the first thing that they care about and that they really experience firsthand, usually when they go over to China, is sort of the basic foundational membership of legal membership, having legal protection and status in the place that they're in. And only once they feel like that base membership has been fulfilled are they kind of psychologically open to exploring and expecting things like national membership? And it's only when that is also then fulfilled do they then think about things like, okay, well, how do I be a good citizen, right? Sort of the ideals associated to civic membership. And they move through this kind of pyramid in an ordered hierarchical manner. And what I find through the personal narratives is that sort of the critical juncture that seems to either shape their openness or closedness towards South Korea's civic integration policies is whether or not the refugees' own ideal of what it means to belong versus the message that they're getting from the host state, which is exclusively and explicitly civic, whether those two things are convergent or divergent. So in this case, it really has to do with, do North Korean refugees actually see co-national membership with South Koreans as being fulfilled at the time that they experience the civic integration policy or not? And depending on that, when those two things are convergent, the refugees are much more sort of psychologically open to embracing civic ideals of membership, think of successful belonging in South Korea in that way, and therefore see the host state as sort of being alongside us in that journey. Whereas North Korean refugees who, for reasons kind of before entry, come into South Korea already kind of doubting whether or not there is co-national membership, see South Korea's civic emphasis as sort of isolating, alienating, and kind of tone deaf. And therefore, there's this othering effect towards the host state that kind of closes down on their receptiveness to the exact same civic integration policies. So let me give you a flavor for what this actually looks like in the narratives. So this is a case where belief of co-national membership enables openness towards civic integration. So, this particular refugee says, only South Koreans are not called foreigners back in North Korea. South Koreans are like distant cousins. To kind of appeal to that, bloodline type of idea of one nationhood. And the way that she talks about successful belonging, how she thinks about that in South Korea is highly civic, right? She uses language such as, other people don't get any help here, but we got all these things from South Korea because we were North Korean. So after a while, it's our responsibility to figure it out and contribute back. And then when you see her sort of talk about her experience at Hanawan, it's very much one of sort of acceptance and mutual constructivism. So, she says, when I went to Hanawan, I realized there's nothing different in the employment law that discriminates against North Koreans. If there is a question mark, it is because of our own emotional security. So over time, we have a duty to show them, as in South Koreans and the host society. And if we're going to show them, we better show them the good side, right? So it's very much kind of almost repeating the civic ideals learned from Hanawan. Now contrast that with a refugee who comes in already doubting sort of this idea of co-national membership. So she says, we're supposed to be the same people, but why do South Koreans treat me differently? Now it's discriminated in China and I'm discriminated here again. The way that she talks about what it means to successfully belong in South Korea is super interesting. She never says co-national membership. But, if you look at what she says, I feel a little bit like I'm a real South Korean when the patrol in my apartment complex says hello to me as he would to a native South Korean, right? And she talks about other examples, from her church where, the church members came to check up on her when she was sick, just as they do for other South Korean members. So when you look at sort of the stories that they tell, it's very much one of when I get treated just like a South Korean, people can't see any difference between myself and a South Korean. So it's very much sort of a national belonging ideal of what it means to be part of South Korean society. And because she thinks about successful belonging that way, her sort of reaction to her Hanawan training and education is very closed off. So she says, at Hanawan, they emphasize that everything that is provided is through tax money from South Koreans. And so we have to give back. but I really wish that they didn't say that so much. I'm here and trying to adapt, and it puts up a wall. And what I find is that, divergence between sort of belonging ideals of the refugee themselves versus the host state can create sort of this othering effect towards the host society and its integration efforts.
Aram, and we just have a clarifying question here. Can you just tell the audience, there are a handful of people who don't have experience with what the whole Hanawan or knowledge of what the whole Hanawan complex is. Can you explain what the refugees go through at Hanawan? You mentioned it in passing, but just can you go through that one more time?
Sure. Hanawan is the government rehabilitation center that all North Korean refugees, after they clear security clearance, are required to spend time for 3 months before they can then join South Korean society. So a lot of Hanawan is devoted to sort of this educational curriculum. Most of the day the refugees are in like classes that focus a lot on sort of employment, job acquirement training, life skill training, et cetera. And Hanawan really is sort of the hallmark integration policy that defines South Korea's approach to North Koreans. So this is sort of their reaction to that policy.
And just to emphasize, this is required of all North Korean refugees to go through this Hanawan training process.
Right. Okay, so the real, the theory that comes out of this narrative analysis is really one of, top-down forces are important, but bottom-up forces, such as how a refugee actually thinks about successful belonging, has a big constraint on their psychological openness or closed-offness towards even the same civic integration policies. So the hypothesis is that divergence then between the refugee versus the host's civic belonging ideal should then reduce receptiveness to and the overall effectiveness of civic integration policies of that host state. So this, in sort of a regression format, is sort of a typical interaction effect kind of setup. So as Steph just said, Hanawan is mandatory. All North Korean refugees go through it and are required to do so. So usually, the effectiveness of an integration policy would be measured through sort of length of exposure or, the content of exposure. But there's no variation in that in this particular case, right? So, to get sort of a level of degree of engagement with the Hanawan's training and educational curriculum, I look at level of satisfaction with the Hanawan experience and I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail. But essentially, satisfaction with the Hanawan integration policy, and then the interaction effect here is with whether or not the refugee himself or herself holds a divergent view about what it means to belong. So the survey data come from face-to-face snowball sampling across these job training centers for North Korean refugees all around Seoul, Incheon, and Gyeonggi areas. The N is right around over 200. I can talk about representative issues here probably in the Q&A if anyone wants to ask more about that. The specific measures of interest here, the first is the actual integration outcome. So I look at the two integration outcomes that the Hanawan policy most cares about and aims for. And the first one is economic integration. And the goal here is to make sure that North Korean refugees get jobs, but in reality, asking about employment status is kind of an unreliable measure here because a lot of North Korean refugees, even when they are employed, are working several contractual jobs that go on and off. So very few of them start out with full-time employment. So instead of that, I look at sort of the frequency of job discrimination based on the fact that they're North Korean that they have experienced so far. The other set of outcomes that civic integration cares about is political integration. So sense of civic duty to vote and civic duty to pay taxes, civic duty to pay taxes is not really a uniquely democratic thing, but it is for North Korean refugees who are coming from a context where the concept of regularized taxes doesn't really exist. So this is a huge part of what Hanawan invests in to teach the North Korean refugees about these responsibilities. Divergence status is coded in a binary way, and it's an answer to this question of how different do you see South Koreans to be on the belief that we are one people. If they answered not very different, they were coded as seeing co-national membership as fulfilled, and any other degree of difference here was coded as feeling not seeing co-national membership as fulfilled. Satisfaction with policy was a sort of composite measure where respondents were asked to evaluate different parts of the Hanawan curriculum that I showed earlier on a 4-point scale of how satisfied they were with that training versus how dissatisfied they were. And this is really to generate sort of a degree of engagement with the integration policy. So I want to start out by just showing you some descriptive data. So this is essentially, the focus here is really on the coefficient of divergent status across all of these different integration outcomes, right? So controlling for things like demographics, as well as political interest, interpersonal trust, what you see is that across the board, refugees who hold divergent belonging ideals from the host state tend to do worse in terms of their integration outcomes, like civic duty to vote, duty to pay taxes, as well as frequency of job discrimination. So why are we seeing that sort of dampening effect for those who hold divergent belonging ideals from the host state? I want you to focus here on the first shaded row. As expected from most of integration policy studies, you see that greater satisfaction or greater engagement here, psychological engagement with the integration policy leads to higher civic integration outcomes across the board. But here, when you see that effect interacted with divergent status, you see a consistently negative interaction effect, i.e., holding a divergent belonging ideal reduces sort of the effectiveness of the estimated effectiveness of the very same civic integration policy that all North Korean refugees go through. Now, at this point, some of you might ask, well, North Korean refugees that hold these divergent ideals versus convergent ideals are probably different in a lot of other ways, and it's true. So in my sample, North Korean refugees who are younger, more female, as well as less educated, tend to see co-national membership as unfulfilled, or at least come in sort of doubting that. So when I run this regression again, kind of matching those two groups to each other based on those demographics that they differ on as a group, the coefficients really barely change at all. And if anything, the negative interaction effect is more precise and more prominent in the case of economic integration. So what does this all matter in sort of a practical sense? So these are the predicted integration outcomes for convergent versus divergent refugees. So starting with the left hand here, for civic duty to vote, the predicted difference here really is between a refugee who sees voting, feels a moderately strong civic duty to vote versus none. In terms of civic duty to pay taxes, the difference is a person who says, paying taxes as a South Korean citizen is very important versus somewhat important. So one category difference there in strength. And in terms of frequency of job discrimination, it's the difference between a North Korean refugee who says, I've never experienced job discrimination based on my background, versus I have definitely experienced at least a few instances of job discrimination. Now, you might look at these graphs and say, well, these are not very big differences. And especially if you add confidence intervals to this, the only one for which it shows a significant statistical difference is civic duty to vote. But the point that I want to highlight is, most of my sample are from recent North Korean refugees with less than 5 years of stay in South Korea. So the thing that we need to think about really is how these effects accumulate over time. So as these slight differences in attitudes lead to kind of habituated non-voting or non-compliance with taxes, or sort of, perpetual cycles of unemployment because of more frequent instances of job discrimination, the thing to focus on is really how it sort of entrenches a virtuous or vicious cycle in their path to integration in South Korea. So the big takeaway from this project is really that, this whole kind of rush towards the civic turn, where a lot of newer democracies dealing with migration for the first time are kind of following the lead of the civic integration approach of a lot of Western host democracies, that civic turn deserves some pause. Two reasons for that. Uh, on top of sort of the supply side factors of things like policy design and timing of citizen naturalization, for example, things that the host state could control in integration design. The big thing that this project shows is that there are also demand side constraints from refugees' own beliefs about what it means to successfully belong that heavily constrain the effectiveness of these integration policies. And taking that seriously really starts to question the exportability of the civic model outside of the West. So especially when we're talking about context of co-ethnic migration or host countries with very strong ethno-nationalist legacies or boundaries, right? Exclusively civic integration approaches can end up unintentionally having exclusionary effects towards certain subgroups of newcomers, and lead to, deeper kind of long-term problems of integration down the road.
Aram, that's just, I just love the work you're doing on this. I just, I think it's really sophisticated and interesting. I'm going to take a question that's come in through the Q&A and just remind the audience, please feel free to ask questions. And here's an anonymous member of our audience who says, from a less informed audience, watch out, this is actually a very good question, asks, whether North Korean refugees enjoy the same welfare benefits, for example, as South Korean citizens. I'm thinking about access to education, healthcare, and legal support. But let me just add a twist to this question, because one of the things about the modeling that concerns me a little bit is how do we know, and maybe this is in the vector of controls, but how do we know that how the North Koreans are treated once they're in South Korea doesn't affect the estimates that you've got here? So you're putting emphasis on their views kind of coming in, but you're interviewing them after they've been out of Hanwon, correct? And so how do we know that some nasty experience with a bus driver, on day one that they're left Hanwon isn't in fact driving, the results you're getting?
So that's a great question. And it's something that I've thought a lot about. So that the answer to that question really doesn't come from the modeling, but really for me comes from the narrative analysis.
Right. Yeah.
So when I process trace the personal narratives, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be some kind of post hoc coloring when they're telling these narratives to me after the fact. But it does seem to me that in cases where refugees say, I firmly do believe in co-national membership, that usually is due to something that predates even entry into South Korea. It has a lot to do with how long, for example, they were essentially stuck in China.
Right.
And those who had longer experiences in China and sustained for the first time, really, sustained discrimination based on their nationality, something that they never really dealt with before while they were in North Korea.
Right.
Come into South Korea kind of already embracing, just before any kind of interaction with a South Korean, embracing the fact that, I am finally home. right? That I'm finally sort of, among my own national people. And it's not that these people don't then experience, discrimination and nasty remarks from bus drivers, et cetera, but they're much more likely in the actual stories that they tell, they're much more likely to cast those experiences as just bad apples, right? So there's
Yeah.
a sort of framing out of those kinds of experiences. And then the opposite holds true for those who already come in, usually because they've had sort of shorter defection pathways into South Korea, sort of a length of a few months as opposed to several years. And didn't really experience sort of sustained national discrimination in China before entry. So already come in with, because in North Korea, the education is that we are one people, but there's a lot of sort of hierarchical ordering that North Korean education puts in there between North and South Koreans. So they come in already with that kind of, yes, we're one people, but there's some ambiguity there. And they're much more likely at the first incident of sort of discrimination say, I knew it, right? I knew it. They don't see us as equals, et cetera. So the answer to that question, doesn't really come from the modeling, because as you said, there's no way to actually get over the fact that these data are collected after all of these things have happened. So there is that issue of sort of post hoc, are they just rationalizing here based on their South Korean experience? But in the narratives, it seems to, it's very actually quite traceable where these beliefs start. And there is some degree of sort of pattern matching here, depending on how long they were stuck in China and sort of the national boundary making that happened in that experience that frames then their approach once they're in South Korea.
That's great. I'm going to call on Yelim Chung, one of our PhD students in the political science department.
Yeah, thank you. This is fascinating, and I think your focus on their stay in China is very, very interesting. I have a kind of follow-up question on Steph and the guest question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the demographics of these North Korean refugees that you spoke with, and perhaps if there were any meaningful differences. For example, I'm curious because you said they came within the past 5 years. Were there differences in terms of those refugees who had experienced or had seen electoral changes in South Korea? Perhaps they voted in a past election and they saw their preferred candidate winning versus someone who hasn't had experience of voting before. And also, I'm wondering if you noticed any patterns of differences between refugees who might have brought all of their family to South Korea and they feel like they're really at home now because they don't have to worry about other family members, or if they still have family members stuck in China or North Korea or some other third country that they continue to worry about. So I was wondering if you noticed anything interesting about that. Thanks.
Thank you. So I definitely do have data on whether they have voted in South Korea. They are, in my sample of a little bit over 200, they are very few and far between. So even if they were there for the electoral turnover, like they just didn't get it together in time to vote, or weren't sure about still how the process really worked, et cetera. But so they're a very small handful, but I can definitely look at that to see if that has any if they behave differently, essentially. The family question is super interesting, and unfortunately, I don't think that I have a question there about whether or not all of their family members have essentially migrated with them. I will say, though, as we know, the bulk of North Korean refugees are women, and a lot of these women. Typically are not of the case where the entire family were able to come over together for various reasons. Usually they've had, children or two in China that they've had to leave to come over to South Korea, et cetera. So again, there, I think, I don't ask that question directly, but my guess is that it's going to be a small subset of the sample. But the voting one, definitely I should check in my data. That's something I can look at.
Becky or Sam, do you want to get in? And again, to our audience, if you want to pose a question, if you just put it in the Q&A, I'll pass it on to Aram.
Let me ask one question.
Sure,
This is
Munsup.
Munsup.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's so fascinating that you have interviewed more than 200 North Korean refugees. So I want to hear more about your field work. So how did you approach to these 200 North Korean refugees? Were they willing to share their very private information? So sort of these things. So I want to basically hear more about your data collection process.
Sure. So the survey data come from over 200 refugees from refugee training centers, but the narrative interviews are only from, I think about, I have a little bit over 30 folks in that sample. So I didn't do in-depth narrative interviews with over 200. I did it with a handful of 30. So in terms of, gaining access to this population, I basically connected with some graduate students in Korea who were doing this kind of qualitative fieldwork with North Korean refugees. So kind of got, plugged into the network that way. One of the refugees that I ended up really connecting with happened to be a teacher at one of these training centers. So it was through her that I, kind of gained access to the training centers, and were able to go through the different ones in sort of the Seoul, Gyeonggi, Incheon area to circulate the surveys. But in terms of the actual narrative interviews, I mean, these took a lot of time. It's not just you can kind of sit down and talk for 2 hours and say, thank you for your time. It really takes a while to build that trust. So these interviews took place kind of, in places that they felt most comfortable, sometimes in their apartments, sometimes in, actually subway stations was a popular one because there's constant movement, right? There's no stationary audience. Open parks was one, but that got really hot because this was done sort of in the summer in South Korea. So a lot of sort of sitting in subway stations, meeting with them multiple times over the course of weeks to not only to get the full interview but to really build that sort of rapport. And I would say that the intro coming from somebody that they already trusted, as an instructor at one of the training centers, et cetera, was a big help in sort of first establishing that rapport and trust in the beginning. But they were, like, the narratives are fascinating, and I didn't really find, maybe because you can't ignore, I think, gender effects when it comes to this kind of field work. And, again, 70% of North Korean refugees are women. And, I'm a Korean woman researcher in the field. I think that definitely helped in terms of sort of their openness and in describing the life events that happened to them.
I had a quick question, if that's okay. I was wondering about the snowballing sampling effect. So is that, if I remember that correctly, that is when you're talking to someone, they might give you a few names that then you can talk to. Would that lead you down a certain path of self-selection of a certain subpopulation of the North Korean refugees? And was there a way to counteract that to make sure you were getting like a good representative sample?
I definitely think there is selection effects there. So the issue with working with or trying to survey any kind of refugee population is there are really important security as well as privacy hurdles into gaining a representative sample. And so in South Korea, for instance, the government has been able to procure sort of representative samples, but they typically don't ask the kind of political questions and the kind of identity questions that I was interested in. And so the other route then is to go through sort of North Korean NGO groups, which have a lot of contacts, but the issue there is that you're dealing with a different kind of selection bias that's very ideological. And so job training centers is sort of, I would say, sort of the best of the imperfect measures in gaining sort of the least ideologically biased sample, because it's, they exist for job training. Also, refugees of all kind of political backgrounds or leanings come there because they need to get jobs. And so they're there for taking classes like computer skills, et cetera. And so, Seoul, Incheon, and Gyeonggi, sort of majority of the North Korean population in South Korea lives in those provinces. So in terms of, trying to take the most kind of unbiased approach to sampling when it's really, sort of achieving the perfect representative sample is nearly impossible with this kind of refugee population, was sort of the best strategy that I could think of, in lieu of going to sort of existing networks that tend to carry selection bias issues of their own.
Sam, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't actually have a particular question, but first I wanted to say thank you, Aram, for your presentation. I thought it was great. I really like that you used statistical analysis here and looking at integration, because I feel like I've seen a lot of people discuss this topic before and haven't used this kind of quantitative approach, and I really appreciate that. Especially because you're using a lot of the same methods that we're learning here in our graduate program. So I really, really like that you incorporated regression modeling here and looking at interactions and data. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's so interesting, because I feel like all I see is sort of quantitative effects of integration regimes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was gonna pose a question. I guess that sort of combined these storylines. So one debate in the earlier generation of literature on the refugees had to do with motivations for crossing the border, and whether they were economic or political. And so I want to set that aside, and maybe you can comment on where that was. I mean, we found in Witness to Transformation that a lot of the motives were economic, which kind of played into a Chinese narrative that these people were not really in fear of being persecuted, but were really like economic migrants. But then I want to somehow connect that with the fact that the finding on voting is so much stronger than the finding on paying taxes and economic integration. And what you made of that, does that have to do with the way that this belonging indicator is sort of defined, that it's like almost a political sense of belonging, isn't it? Or is it? I'm asking you to put together two very different things. But.
So I think there's been a shift in sort of the primary motivation of North Korean refugees coming to South Korea. I think initially, definitely, the primary motivation was economic, and this was, largely sort of response to the Great Famine, et cetera. These are refugees who are coming over, in my sample, sort of in the sort of 2000, late 2010s, or sorry, early 2010s-ish, that window. And the primary motivation that I find, at least in this sample, is what you would say political, but it's not what it seems like. So when they say political, I mean, I group it that way, but what they actually mean when they say for political reasons, it's not sort of, I don't like the regime, or I want to live in a more democratic place. It's actually more things that we would think of as sort of social mobility. So a lot of these refugees were cases where they were kind of fed up with the fact that they couldn't go to the university that they wanted to because their grandfather or whoever had done something against the regime, and they were forever marked, for example. That opportunities for both political mobility but also socioeconomic mobility were quite constrained in North Korean society. So, those kinds of ideas of political freedom. So it's not the sense of, I'm seeking democracy, but that sort of was their understanding of I came here for political reasons was really that.
Well, that to me is economic, frankly.
Okay, so
I mean, I would think of those as largely economic motives. I mean, I think of a woman in North Korea who's a doctor, and just has glass ceiling issues, and her income is limited, and she wants to get out because she's tired of. But the narratives are often more complicated than that, because they're also about whether you can just be a professional in that setting. Questions like that, which verge on the political.
Yeah, I mean, when people usually say economic versus political, I think they're thinking about these are, anti-regime and, seeking democracy. It's definitely not that. They're understanding.
Well, it could be religious freedom, though, for example. I mean.
So I didn't see much of that, but again, this is a very particular sample, right? So we would have to look at sort of the more representative ones that the government does do on these things. But the main reason had to do more with, if you want to say that that's sort of economic mobility, social mobility, sort of that kind of freedom, was sort of the primary reason. The effect on the sort of outsized, it's there. I see the largest kind of difference in terms of civic duty to vote versus taxes or economic sort of discrimination, job discrimination, and I think I've thought about this a lot, but I think that the reason for that is, for taxes, they know that it's a legal obligation. And so there's just less room for saying, there's less room there. Voting, the civic duty to vote is actually something that's quite new to them in the sense that like they voted in North Korea, but it was never free. And so the freedom around, whether or not I can decide to vote is something actually that's quite new to them. And therefore it's the easiest one for them to sort of close off towards. They know that, in Hanawan education, they emphasize a great deal, they have them practice casting a vote, etc., really walk them through the process. And it's the one thing out of the three outcomes that I look at that is directly under their voluntary control, that I can say, you know what, I don't want to do that, right? I don't want to contribute my time and effort when I feel that this host country doesn't even understand the basic of what I need to feel like I belong here. Because, job discrimination is something that they can't really control. It happens to them. Civic duty to pay taxes, they vary in sort of how important they see that to be. But at the end of the day, they know that when they earn enough income to be eligible actually for taxes, that it's a legal obligation. Voting, free voting, is something that is new to them, that is entirely under their control. And it's the one that's most, I think, susceptible to psychological sort of closing off of participation in the host society.
Great. Munsub, do you want to do another round of questions? Do you have anything, Munsub or Yelim?
Not for now.
Not for now, yeah. Yelim, anything from you?
No, I think she answered my question. So.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you an unfair question here at the end, which is to step back from the findings here and tell us what you think this implies for the eventuality in which South Korea would be called on to absorb large numbers of refugees, and whether you would change the Hanawan process based on your findings. In other words, put simply, is South Korea doing this in the right way, Aram? Or do your findings have implications about how South Korea should be approaching the diminishing number of refugees? Right now, it seems to be falling under Kim Jong-un, particularly in the last several years, if I'm correct. But would you change things at Hanawan? Would you change the focus?
No, I think the main implication that comes from this is that there needs to be some diversification in the Hanawan approach. So, so far, sort of any explicit measure in terms of national assimilation is seen as somehow violating the co-national principle. And that's the reason why Hanawan's policy is very explicitly civic, skills-based, a workfare approach, all of these terms that different scholars have used to describe it. I find that about half and half in my sample are those who come in with very strong co-national identification versus not. And for the other half of North Korean refugees who do not come with that, Hanawan tends to have, very deep backlash effects. they see the whole Hanaon experience not as welcoming or even, really preparing them for South Korean society, and see it much more sort of tone deaf, and not actually a genuine effort to integrate, which goes against, I think, sort of the intent of Hanaon, which is precisely the point. So if the intent is to actually try to maximize smooth and economic, social, but as well as political integration, there needs to be some diversification process in the actual curriculum that emphasizes national assimilation, not in a top-down manner that sort of reifies national hierarchies, as in you have to assimilate to South Korean society, but more opportunities for sort of horizontal interaction. So when I visited in 2018, the director talked about a new program where they essentially send North Korean refugees as kind of sort of have them stay with volunteer South Korean families. And I didn't quite get to the point of how they recruit these volunteer South Korean hosts. But they were starting to roll something like that out, where they would spend a day or spend a weekend with a South Korean host family. And I think more of those kinds of opportunities to build those horizontal alliances with members of South Korean society that goes both ways, are sort of integral to diversifying South Korea's approach if what they care about really is multidimensional integration.
So let me, that's a great segue into my last question, which I think, if the next time you give this presentation, it's an idea for how to set it up from the outset. So how do we think about the opposite of civic integration? I mean, you make mention of this idea of national integration, but what would a curriculum look like, or what would an ideal be like, which would be less focused on this civic obligation and more focused on what's the kind of opposite to that?
I think emphasis on the cultural similarities that exist. So, it's a matter of framing, right? So in terms of language, there's definitely differences in language, and this is a huge pain point for North Korean refugees. But in the way that those differences are highlighted, instead of saying these are the different things and you need to learn, essentially catch up with South Korean language, emphasizing sort of the historical shared roots of those languages and why they sort of ended up differing over time, et cetera. It's definitely something not to do, I think, is South Korea's approach to sort of marriage migrants. And setting up, like tanuri centers and et cetera, where they come and learn sort of South Korean traditions, which I think is still important. I'm not saying that we should not do that, but doing that creates, essentially sort of a national hierarchy by reifying the fact that the native culture is superior and therefore you need to assimilate or absorb. A better approach would be to have opportunities for activities that, for example, foreign marriage migrants and native Korean wives can do together in a more parallel sense, in a more horizontal sense.
Right.
Now, this obviously takes an enormous amount of resources, right, to do it that way, to facilitate these kinds of exchange opportunities, et cetera. But if the goal is to really help with national belonging, but not assimilation, not absorption, I really
Right.
do think it's the only way.
Yeah, well, that takes us right. That's a great way to close, because that takes us into this whole question of multiculturalism. Ultimately, I mean, would it be possible for South Korea to conceive a North Korean refugee policy that was actually multicultural and said, we're not trying to make you South Koreans, you are North Koreans, but we want you to still feel welcome in this setting? I mean, that would be extremely challenging to do, but I think your paper is very interesting in suggesting that might have to be a piece of this going forward, is accepting a certain amount of difference as a principle.
Yeah, certainly policy convergence towards an exclusively civic approach, whether it's in South Korea or Germany or whatnot, is definitely warrants a bit of a pause there.
Yeah. Well, listen, I can't thank you enough. That was just fascinating. And I agree entirely with Sam that I think it's good for our students to see that these kind of questions can be addressed not just simply through you know, the kinds of in-depth interviews you did, which are interesting in themselves, but you can at least get enough power in this sample to get some results. Aram, thanks very much for joining us. And I look forward to continuing our dialogue about North Korean refugees, which has been going on for 5 or 6 years now.
Thank you so much, Steph.
It's a real pleasure. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.